Hey traders, welcome back to the weekly Forex Forecast. Yesterday, Jerome Powell gave a speech reiterating higher for longer in the US, and this puts stagflation setups to the top of my watch list going into next week.
We have tightened policy significantly over the past year. Although inflation has moved down from its peak, a welcome development, it remains too high. We are prepared to raise rates further if appropriate and intend to hold policy at a restrictive level until we are confident that inflation is moving sustainably down toward our objective.
Okay, so a very quick look at the economic calendar for this week shows us there's some data coming out, CPI from Australia on Wednesday. We also have preliminary GDP out of the US, of course, lagging data, but this is likely to bring a bit of volatility. And we also have inflation core PCE price index data on Thursday. So all of these are likely to bring some volatility, and non-farm payrolls on Friday. But generally speaking, we have a pretty clear run at the markets, and there's nothing I see here that we need to plan for in terms of short-term trading throughout the week next week. Looking at the scores for the coming week, you can see there's no net change week over week. So going into this week, I do like the Aussie, the New Zealand and the yen to the short side once again, as well as the pound, the franc, the US dollar, and we're also going to look at CAD yen. So although we have the same scores and I am looking at many of the same markets, there is a slight difference this week to last week, which is that Jackson Hole speech from Jerome Powell yesterday, reiterating higher for longer and kind of entrenching this stagflationary regime, at least for the time being. I do think this turns into a deflationary recessionary regime at some point in the near future, but right now it looks like we still have one final act of this stagflationary regime. And because of that, going into this week, I primarily like the yen shorts. Those are my top plays. I'm also going to be looking at CAD yen, which we didn't look at in last week's video. Why? Because if we are going to get some stagflationary play, especially crude oil bouncing this week, then I do think that CAD yen is going to be one of those kind of stagflationary setups that you'd really want to be paying attention to. So I do like after the Japanese yen shorts, Aussie and New Zealand shorts, and you may say, but John, these are commodity currencies, surely they will outperform in stagflation. The stagflationary regime we've been seeing, and I am looking to continue into next week, is on the services side. When you look globally, even in the US, which is yet to go into contraction in the services sector, it has been in a manufacturing recession essentially for quite a while. And now we're seeing the deterioration in the Chinese data. And of course, this is why we're still seeing the Australian dollar especially underperforming despite this kind of re-emergence of inflation or stagflation, because it's on the services side. And of course, you know, those export countries, especially the Australian dollar with its links to China, they're being hammered still despite the stagflation. So I will be focused on yen shorts going into next week, Aussie and New Zealand shorts, and primarily versus the US dollar. So again, although the pound is slightly stronger in the scorecards, because of that speech, I would preference the US dollar to the upside, followed by the pound, then the Swiss franc, and also the Canadian dollar, like I said, versus the Japanese yen next week. Okay, so quick run through of the individual currencies before we move on to the pairs themselves that I like the best heading into next week. And you can see, I tweeted out recently that the dollar index was likely to recover most of this year's losses pretty quickly. And in 6 weeks from the low, this capitulation bottom, which I highlighted also in the weekly Forex Forecast videos for you, this has erased nearly 3/4, so 75% of the entire down move this year. I am now looking, now we've closed above the 7-year breakout, I'm looking for this market to test the high of the year at the 105.883 in the coming weeks. Next is the euro now, just as the dollar is expected from me to test the high of the year and then some. I think we're going to break through there. I am looking for the euro to come down, test this low, and also the major breakout of the 1.06710 over the coming weeks as well. And I do think once we break through here, and as we break into the yearly highs, I think we could actually see momentum to the downside and to the upside in the dollar, that is, once we break the high. And I do think we are now starting the journey back down to the major low in the euro. And my base case, as I've been saying for quite a while, is that this happens with a risk-off catalyst, a global recession, and of course that flight safety in the dollar. So I'm not saying this is going to happen next week, but I do think we break down here in the coming weeks. Maybe we consolidate, and then at some point heading into Q4 or Q1, we do get a global recession and we see this sell-off as we get the flight safety in the dollar. Next is the pound. Now the pound has been very resilient and we've been trading this to the upside on a relative basis in the scorecards pretty much all year. We've been focused on pound shorts. I do think we come back and test the major breakout of the 1.2462. But we do have, relatively speaking, a bit of an inflation problem in the UK, and I do think the pound is going to be holding up fundamentally slightly better than the others. So I do think we come back and retest the 1.2462, but on a relative basis, I still like it versus the yen, the New Zealand, the Aussie going into next week. Next is the Swiss franc. Ever since we traded into the major yearly target of the 1.1700, which I highlighted on January the 1st, we have reversed and we've been selling off. However, I do not believe that this is a major reversal in the Swiss franc. And again, on a relative basis, based on what the scorecards are saying, I still like this versus the yen. And also, I'm going to be looking at versus those commodity currencies like the New Zealand and also the Aussie next week. Next is Japanese yen, and I highlighted this earlier on in the video, had it slide in and show you how I do think this is part of that final act of the stagflationary regime that we're in before we move into a deflationary recessionary regime. And one of those is TLTs trading into the low that I'm looking for. Another is credit spreads, which we haven't looked at in this video, but I'll be looking for them to start to blow out to the upside if we're moving into recession. And also the Japanese yen. I do think we are going to see this move into the low as the final act of stagflation plays out over the next few weeks. And therefore, I still like, despite the fact I'm expecting a global recession, despite the fact the yen should rally on a flight to safety, I am still looking at this as part of that final stagflationary act, as I said. So I like yen shorts once again. Once we trade into these lows, we may need to be a bit careful because as a recessionary regime kicks in, yen shorts are going to be risky. But I like the yen down to the lows and I'll be looking for this as one of my top shorts until we reach these lows in the Japanese yen. Next is the CAD. Has been holding up relatively better out of all the commodity currencies, but you can see pretty much all year I've been identifying this as a correction that we're going to likely trade into the high over here. A couple of times we thought this wouldn't be the case because we started to sell off, but we have traded into this, and this was where I've been highlighting to you a potential bigger reversal down to the low and perhaps even then some if we do get that risk off catalyst. So I do like the stagflationary setup of the CAD versus the yen next week, but aside from that, I don't really like the CAD versus the other currencies. I think there are better markets to trade, namely the US dollar to the long side and also the Japanese yen to the short side. Next is the Aussie, really struggling with the poor data globally and especially out of China, and I have been highlighting this to the downside all year. First and foremost, this low, which I do think we could take out in the coming weeks, but I do think we retest this low on a flight to safety in a more recessionary regime later this year. And finally, the New Zealand dollar, which again I've been highlighting to the downside all year, looking for this prior low. And although we got choppy throughout the year, we've started to break out. So you can see there is quite a way to go now down to the prior low. How quickly we do this, will depend on a number of factors, but I do think we've started the journey down towards this prior low now. And the New Zealand dollar alongside the Aussie and the CAD, these are going to get affected the most by any recession globally or risk off regime coming into the back part of this year and Q1 of next year. Okay, so let's have a look at the markets themselves, starting with crude oil as always. And last week I was looking for long setups in crude oil. And going into this week, I once again favor crude oil to the long side. So I can either be long crude oil or do nothing this week. And this is still part of that stagflationary regime, which is coming to an end, but as I said, still looks like it has some fuel left in the tank. So as we get a new week starting, any pullback, and you can see we've already started to trend down. So any continued pullback and breakout is viewed as the opportunity to look for longs into the 84 area. And if we come down and test the lower bound here at the 77, this would be the second place next week I'd be looking for potential long opportunities in crude oil. Okay, so the first Forex pair is US dollar yen, and you can see we've already started to break out. So what I'd be looking for next week is any pullback. I'd like to see a correction first. Would be viewed as the opportunity to look for bullish breakouts into the 14850. And if we just continue to push higher, you can see we may actually already be breaking out here. So if we push a little bit higher like this, you look for a pullback, and then I'll be looking for a rally into the 14850. The second thing I'd be looking for next week in US dollar yen is if we can pull back, if we fail to break out, say we fail at these highs and we start to pull back, If we test the 14450, this is the second place next week, I'd be looking for potential long opportunity in US dollar yen. Next is pound yen. I can either be long pound yen or do nothing next week. Selling this market is not an option. We've already started to sell off counter trend here. So any continued pullback is viewed as an opportunity to look for bullish breakouts next week into the 187. And we have a good chance of it doing this because we sold off last week. If we continue and we fail to break out, we just trend down next week into the 18150. It's the second place I'd be looking for a short-term buying opportunity in pound yen next week. Next is franc yen, another market here with the yen in it, which is just consolidating. And this is great because the market consolidates and then it rallies, consolidates and then it rallies. So any continued pullback and breakout next week is going to be viewed as the opportunity to look for bullish setups into the 16750. And again, if we come back all the way down and we fail to break out and we just trend down next week into the 16350, it's the second place I'd be looking for a short-term buying opportunity in franc yen. And the final yen pair is CAD yen. Now, if we get that rally in crude oil next week, this is going to be supportive of the CAD. I prefer these other markets, especially the dollar versus the yen. However, any pullback in this market, I am going to reactively be looking for a potential breakout to the upside, especially if crude oil starts to rally as well. And any pullback, I'm going to be looking for longs into the 109.250 area. And again, if we just hold this trend and we hold this trend and we pull back into the 106, this is the second place next week I would consider looking for a buying opportunity in CAD yen. Next is euro dollar, and this was a market highlighted to the downside last week, and we came down almost to the pip and tested the target to the downside here. Coming into this week, I do like this to the downside once again, but because we tested that lower bound, I would not be surprised to see this pullback and correct. So any pullback is viewed as an opportunity to look for bearish breakouts and reversals down to the 1.0680. And if we just continue to pull back and trend into the 1.090, maybe we even poke through and test this high, this would be an area I'd be looking for a near-term short opportunity in euro dollar next week. I do favor New Zealand dollar and Aussie dollar. I prefer these as shorts because they're both weaker in the scorecards than the euro. But I do like euro dollar to the downside as well next week after New Zealand and Aussie shorts. Next is New Zealand dollar. Now we look at euro dollar every week, that's why it's here, but this is actually my favorite short heading into next week in terms of the dollar plays. Okay, again, US dollar yen to the upside, that would be my favorite US dollar long. But in terms of these commodity currencies shorting versus the dollar, it is New Zealand dollar I like the best. We've already consolidated, so any pullback is simply viewed as an opportunity to look for bearish reversals, and I like to see momentum breaking out first, and that is going to set up the opportunity for a follow through into the 0.5820. And if we just continue to pull back and we test this high, and we've got multiple highs in this area, this would be the second place, the 0.600 area, where I'd look for a near-term short opportunity in New Zealand dollar next week. But I can either sell this or do nothing. Buying this market next week for me is not an option. Next is Aussie dollar, another market which has been consolidating, which is nice because again, we get corrections and then we get sell-offs. And we may already see, this could actually be already breaking out. So any pullback next week is viewed as the opportunity to look for a new breakout next week down towards the 0.630. If for whatever reason we pull back and maybe we get an A, a B, and a C, and we test the 0.650, this would be secondarily the reactive place I'd be looking for a short in Aussie dollar to the downside next week. Next is pound New Zealand. So we're looking at the pound pairs here. And yes, pound yen is probably my favorite pound long trade next week because of the yen. But pound New Zealand, pound Aussie, I do like both of these as well. Pound New Zealand has traded into the lower bound. So remember, when we're looking at this and I say to you, if we just pull back and we trade into the lower bound, this is where I'd be looking for potential long opportunity. There was a short-term bounce. This could have been traded at the end of last week. However, because we've already tested this, I would not be surprised to see this market start to break out from this area next week. And I'm going to be looking up towards the previous high and into the 2.160. If for whatever reason we get a second week of selling into the 2.1, let's say 0.250, this would be the second place next week I'd be looking for potential buy opportunity in pound New Zealand. I am not going to be shorting this market under any circumstances next week. Next is pound Aussie, another market which pulled back into the buy zone here at the 1.960 last week. I did actually take a long opportunity in this and it was profitable, but it didn't quite bounce as much as I wanted it to. But coming into this week, I do think now this is setting up for a potential breakout from this area into the 1.990, especially if we come through and we test this high. I do think there's a good opportunity up towards at least the 1.990 next week, if not the previous high. If we break down again, and this just trends lower, just with pound New Zealand is exactly the same, we test the 1.940, this will once again be an opportunity to look for a short-term buy in pound Aussie next week. Next is New Zealand franc. Now this market has just been consolidating, and again this is great because we need these consolidations before we can get the next leg down or up, and in this case I am looking for this to start to break lower. You can see we're already threatening a bit of a breakout down here, consolidated, now we're failing. But I'd like to see this go with more momentum. So if we break through with momentum, I'm going to be looking for a potential follow through into the 0.5150 next week. And if we hold here and we bounce and we just start to pull all the way back, maybe test this low at the 0.52, let's say 90, this would be the second place next week I'd be looking for a potential short in New Zealand franc. And the final Forex pair here is Aussie franc. We are correcting, consolidating. This is fantastic because we need these before we can get the next leg down in this case. If we start to break, I'm going to be looking for a pullback and a follow through down towards the prior low and the 0.5580 area. But again, like New Zealand versus the Swiss franc, if we bounce and we hold, we don't break, we just hold, I'm going to be looking for a pullback, possibly a test of this high at the 0.5750 area, and this is the second place reactively I'll be looking for a short in this market next week. Again, I can only be short this market or do nothing next week, same with New Zealand franc. Buying this is not an option for me next week. Okay, so wrapping up the video with gold, silver, and Bitcoin, starting with gold. And last week I highlighted this blue area and we whipped this, and this was an area I said last week to start to look for potential shorts. And I did actually short gold. This was a nice trade from the end of last week. We had a really nice sell-off, especially once we had the Jackson Hole speech and we started to sell off down here and a rally in the dollar. So this was a good market for a potential short. And this is, again, when I go through the video today and I've said to you, if we pull back into this area, I'm looking for a potential bounce. This is a good example of one which worked nicely last week, in this case from the upper bound. So coming into this week, I'm once again only really interested in being short gold. Any pullback in this area is viewed as an opportunity to look for a breakout of this correction down to the previous low and the 1880. And if we pull all the way back, just as we did last week, we pulled all the way back and tested the upper bound. If we do that again, I'm only going to be looking for a short once again in gold from the 1950 area roughly. There's a nice high over here, and this would be a good resistance area to pair with this zone here. So if we pull back into this area, I'm going to be looking once again for a potential short in gold. Out of these three markets, I am bearish on all of them once again. It's gold I prefer the best out of these three. Next is silver. Now, silver was a market I was looking to the downside again last week, and you can see this was the zone highlighted to the upside, and we smashed through this. And I actually shorted silver as well last week, in fact twice, once here at this first upper bound, and then again over here to try and cost average this a bit, which the cost average was successful, but I did take a loss on the overall trade. But going into this week, I do favor silver shorts once again. Despite this rally, I do only really want to be short based on the outlook for the dollar. So going into this week, because of that big rally above the upper bound last week, I'm a bit hesitant to trade this to the short side, although I am short or do nothing. I prefer gold shorts, but if we pull back once again and we start to break lower this week, I am going to be looking for a potential short down into the 2340. And if we pull all the way back and retest the upper bound, despite my initial short not being successful in this last week, I would once again be looking to short silver from these areas up here, potentially just for a short-term reversal like I was able to get in gold last week. And last but not least, we have Bitcoin consolidating after this big sell-off, and I really would only be short Bitcoin or do nothing next week. So any pullback in this market is viewed as an opportunity to look for bearish reversals down to the 24750. And if we trade into the 27500, this is the second place next week I'd be looking for a potential short in Bitcoin. It is not one of my favorite markets. It hasn't been for a while. I do prefer these markets highlighted in gold next week. So that is it for me for this week, guys. As always, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, why not consider joining us in the room each day where I go through these markets and the setups that I'm personally looking at with members on a daily basis for over 75 markets in different asset classes, including stocks, bonds, Forex, and commodities.